All right. Great. Well, welcome everyone. We're so happy that you were able to join us today. Happy summer solstice. My name is Hannah Wang, and for the past 2 years, I've been the project manager for the BitCuratorEdu project at Educopia Institute. And I will let Cal and Jess introduce themselves as they go through their slides. Yeah, I agree. It's terrific to see so many familiar names and faces. Thank you all for being here. And I will just go ahead and hand it over to Cal. We have a pretty light agenda here. Yeah, without further ado, Cal.
Thanks so much. Thank you, Hannah. And yeah, so Hannah will be the keeper of the slides. So I'll just say go ahead and advance to the next one if you don't mind, Hannah. So I'm going to start out talking about just a little bit about the project that sits behind these products that we're going to be sharing with you today. The BitCuratorEdu project, it was originally the BitCurator.edu project, and then we realized that's a terrible project name because it becomes a link automatically in everyone's email. So this is funded by IMLS. The idea is study and advance the adoption of open source digital forensics tools and methods in professional education for sort of LIS professional education. I'll say as a very brief caveat, and we can get into this in more detail if people are interested at some point, probably offline outside of this workshop. We're not really talking about digital forensics for law enforcement. We're really talking about a set of tools, methods, and principles that can inform and assist library, archives, and museum practices. So just that's important to point out, is that we're not talking about pure and simple digital forensics education. This is a partnership between SILS, where I am at UNC, Educopia Institute, where Hannah and Jess are, Council of State Archivists, and also several master's level programs in LIS, media preservation, that sort of area, those sorts of areas. So go ahead, Hannah, for the next slide. Thank you. So we had two fundamental research questions driving this project. One is, what are the primary institutional and technical factors that influence adoption of, again, and when I say digital forensics tools and methods, it's disk imaging, it's creating checksums, it's these various technical practices that don't actually mean doing digital forensics for law enforcement. What are the most viable mechanisms for sustaining collaboration among LIS programs? And you'll really see in our milestones and deliverables and all of those things that we've tied the various work activities into these two fundamental research questions. So go ahead, Hannah, with the next one. Project goals and deliverables: produce and disseminate a number of different learning objects that you're going to be hearing about today. Looking again at those institutional factors to try to identify what will help people to better incorporate these sort of things into their teaching. And this can be in graduate level programs, it can be continuing education, advancing a community of practice around these sort of methods and approaches, and also producing a white paper at the end that hopefully everyone will see and benefit from to some degree at least. Go ahead, Hannah. Next slide, please. Thank you very much. So we just wanted to share a little bit of the historical context for those who aren't aware. We're really going to be talking about the products of this project and not the underlying software. But it's useful to know that there have been these series of projects funded by the Mellon Foundation, BitCurator in 2 phases, BitCurator Access and BitCurator NLP, that essentially develop not just the underlying tools that we're going to be talking about using in education, but extremely importantly, from my perspective, the community around them, right? And so that's really what has helped us to think about how do we bridge between what's developing in the professional arena and how people can be kind of better educated and prepared to engage in that. So BitCurator itself developed this specialized kind of Linux environment that can be used for these kind of tasks. BitCurator Access looked a little bit more at, once you've acquired data in those ways, how can you provide better access to it? And then BitCurator NLP applied natural language processing in a variety of ways. So go ahead, Anna, if you don't mind. Next slide. Associated with this is also the BitCurator Consortium. So this has been a bunch of software projects that have been grant funded and happening in universities and nonprofit institutions that, you know, can't just sustain software with grant funds once the grant funds run out. And so the consortium, formed in 2014, is really the community around the software. It sets the direction. They have programming every year. And it's really trying to strike this balance between everything being very, very open in terms of discussion, documentation, but also having a few kind of specific benefits to institutions that become members of the consortium in terms of setting the direction of the software, having a help desk, and these sorts of things. And if you're interested in the BitCurator Consortium, I can say many of us on this call would be happy to talk to you further about it down the road. But the BitCurator Consortium is a fundamental player and partner to all this work that we're talking about. So go ahead, Hannah, next slide. Okay, so just BitCuratorEdu Milestones. This is the final thing I'm going to talk about before I hand off to Jess. Is just our project started back in 2018. I will say for any of those who feel kind of gun shy about, sorry, probably a horrible turn of phrase to use at this point. People were feeling very reserved about trying to put in grant proposals. This project started in 2018 after our fourth submission of a grant proposal, right? So it was finally accepted by IMLS. So we decided this was important enough to really persist in these proposals. I think they just got sick of hearing from us, so they gave us some money. But anyway, so we had our advisory board interviews. We have a really terrific advisory board coming from a number of different institutions. We had an advisory board workshop where we kind of came together, strategized, talk about what people's needs and experiences were. We did more data collection, survey, and interviews. We developed these various learning objects you'll be hearing about. We had yet another side of, bookend advisory board workshop. We had an educator summit in the fall of 2021. And these are all things you can read and learn more about from the project website and from the Educopia website. The BCC itself, and this is something you'll hear a little bit more about, developed this educators membership working group. So how do we tap more people into this community who aren't just working for institutions that become members? And then, here we are now with the things we're doing in this webinar and the white paper that will be coming out. And so I guess I'm turning it over to Jess for talking a little bit more about lessons we've learned from all of this work, and then we'll also transition into some of the products coming out of it.
Yeah, I can't wait to get to see those products because they're so awesome, but I am going to talk a little bit more about the research that we did and the lessons that we learned. My name is Jess Farrell. I'm the community facilitator for the BitCurator Consortium, and I started on this project as the project manager in 2018 and then became a co-PI later on. So I have been involved in this project from nearly the point that it started. But we had adequate time to explore our research questions over the 4 years of this project. We got to ask our questions in many different venues. We got to ask our questions to many different audiences with different modes of generating feedback. So as the timeline in the last slide indicates, we sent traditional survey instruments. We held ongoing advisory board meetings that served as frequent focus groups. We got feedback and stories in the hallways and Zoom rooms of conferences, both pre-COVID and since COVID. And we've held several workshops and other events throughout the project, and we sent out surveys and got feedback on them every single time. This also allowed us to iterate a bit throughout the project and develop a lot of ideas about what was out of scope for the project that would be really good for next steps for the community. So I'll talk a little bit about that too. And while we heard from many diverse viewpoints, here are a few learnings that emerged and really drove the design and development of our project deliverables in the end. Next slide, please. The first is a few things about the teaching materials themselves. So instructors preferred adaptable and modular learning objects as opposed to a whole curriculum with lesson plans already kind of in place. So for example, this means maybe a data set that can be used for an instructor to design their own activity around, or an activity that they can slot into something that pairs well with a lecture that they've already designed, or a video or other type of learning object to serve as pre-reading material for a particular lesson. So library and information science programs vary. I'm sure that you'll hear us say that many more times during this presentation. That's one thing that we definitely learned. And LIST instructors are innovative and creative thinkers who enjoy the process of building out their course material. That's why they have the job that they have, right? So what the community wants or needs right now isn't necessarily what it will always need. So I am interested in asking this question and continuing into the future, like what types of lessons work for you? Is it discrete objects or more of a curriculum over time, and seeing how the answer to that question changes. We also learned that instructors desire realistic data sets. So ideally, this might look like a really direct partnership with a community archive or area special collections and archival organizations. But in reality, there are many policy and security barriers to these types of direct interactions. So even if policy were no barrier at all and security were no barrier at all, the level of coordination required to develop these types of connections and projects is really just too high for most programs. It's one thing if you're sending a person along for like a physical in-person internship, all well understood. It's totally different to just be like, hey, can we access your collection data so we can, you know, do some learning here in the classroom. So, you know, knowing that all of these issues were root ones to address, but totally out of scope for this project that we had embarked upon with BitCuratorEdu. We instead gathered some data sets and we added some context to them to explain how they could be used in people's lessons. We also used them in some of the learning objects themselves. And, you know, they're totally acceptable data sets for learning purposes. They've been used in many successful digital curation courses, but they aren't data sets that were originally developed for digital archives training. And so many practitioners, especially, have noted that some of the questions that they are faced with on a day-to-day basis in their jobs can't really be explored in some of these existing data sets that we have. So we thought that in the future, it would be great to fund the development of data sets customized for digital forensics and digital curation use cases. And then finally, we learned that instructors desire a web-based BitCurator sandbox. This is not surprising at all. And this was one where also full stop, it's a whole other project to really embark on that. And I'll talk a lot more about that later. But the BitCuratorEdu project was funding the development of learning objects, but not the software itself. As Cal mentioned, there's so many projects to develop software in the past before this project. There are complex viability and hosting model questions that would need to be explored in order to do this. And the community is definitely encouraged to come together to address this high priority need for future BitCurator development. And I'll talk more about those complex issues in a minute. Go ahead to slide 12. Okay, and then we had several learnings around digital curation and forensics education. So we saw some patterns as we talked to different instructors. One is that digital forensics training tends to be rather squeezed in the timeline. So perhaps it's one unit in a larger digital stewardship course or digital preservation course, or even a broader topic course than that, just appraisal, right? This really isn't enough time for students to do complicated assignments, especially if they involve downloading the software and actually interacting with the software. We also learned, unsurprisingly, that aptitudes and comfort levels of instructors are highly variable. This was, you know, this probably didn't require a lot of research to really know, but it did require some research to understand, because there were no previously developed training materials that really addressed like this reality. So I would say that, you know, throughout the learning objects that you'll see in a minute, we really hope that all of these learning objects paired with the educator's guide will help any instructor who wants to teach this topic develop a baseline shared understanding of how to use BitCurator in teaching and how to tap into the BitCurator consortium as a support mechanism along the way. And then also we learned that access to technical support varies from institution to institution. We documented a similar pattern, or maybe a lack of pattern, I should say, in some previous Educopia research projects like the OSS ArcFlow project. Organizations are just so different in how they are resourced. They're so different in how their technical support teams are organized and in what expertise they even have on staff. So the needs of educators who want to teach digital forensics are arguably a little bit niche compared to maybe the large missions that IT departments and technical support has across libraries. And so some of our partners did have access to a lab. They had access to appropriate technical support for doing hands-on digital forensics activities. But these definitely were, you know, the 1% of organizations. And when COVID entered the scene, even these luxuries became a lot less relevant to everybody overall, because everybody was pretty much teaching online. These learning objects, we hope that we really tried our best to develop learning objects that can be used regardless of how much outside technical support is available. And of course, remember the BitCurator Consortium community is always there to And on that note, we learned that educational institutions and instructors need to engage in a more collaborative approach. And so we experimented with that during the project. I'm excited to share more about the educators membership pilot that sought to address that. Before I do that, I just wanted to share a couple of reports here on the slide that summarize these findings. You can go to the NDSA DigiPress conference in 2021. There's a recording there. And we did a blog post as well on the barriers to teaching digital forensics. Next slide. Okay, to touch back on the community of practice for educators. So to help instructors and institutions develop collaborative approaches to digital forensics education, we underwent several activities to cultivate a community of practice for educators. Throughout the process, we learned that educators benefit from collaborating and talking with their peers. Educators also benefit from collaborating and collaborating with and learning from practitioners. Educators look for community memberships that will offer benefits, especially to their students, to aid them in teaching. And educators, particularly in higher education, have very limited bandwidth to participate in community activities. And so the BitCuratorEdu project really tried to provide as many of these benefits within the confines of audience capacity that we could. So our frequent advisory board meetings provided the space to collaborate and learn from each other. We invited advisory board members to attend monthly BCC community calls so that they could connect with practitioners and hear from practitioners. We then piloted a community model that comprised events for students that provided the opportunity to learn subject matter as well as network with practitioners. So it was able to achieve both of those goals at once. And next slide. Oh, I'm passing it off to Hannah to talk.
Yeah.
Great.
I wasn't sure if you had something else. All right, thank you, Jess. Yeah, as I mentioned, I'm Hannah and I've been the project manager on this project for the last couple of years. And I get to do kind of the fun part, show and tell of what we created. So throughout the course of the project, we created and collected a series of learning objects, which are really lesson plans, slides, exercises, data sets, and other materials that are meant to help instructors provide digital curation or forensics education. Some of these were created by project staff. Some of them were created by our partners and adapted with permission. All of them are available under a CC license to reuse and adapt as needed. You'll see that many of them have very kind of minimal branding, and that is intentional. This is supposed to be kind of the raw materials that can help instructors just really kind of take them and adapt them as needed to their own kind of pedagogical needs and styles. So one other thing to note is that the learning objects were mostly available and distributed through the BitCuratorEdu project website hosted by UNC throughout the course of the project. However, as I'm sure you all know, there are a lot of projects where there's kind of a special project website that's spun up just for the course of the project, and then it is, you know, just kind of abandoned at the end of the project. Nobody's responsible for maintaining it. This is kind of just the endemic problem to these types of projects. So in order to address this and also kind of to simplify the pipeline of BitCurator resources that are available, we partnered with the BCC Documentation and Training Committee to put all of the resources on the BCC website, which is maintained on an ongoing basis by that community of practitioners. So all of the learning objects are available on the BCC website at this link, if I can find the chat. Here it is. That's fine. So I will share my screen with that landing page. So the learning objects are all kind of available here now, and I will just kind of go through and highlight a few of them. We created a few dozen discrete learning objects throughout the course of the project. And there's not really time to go through every single one, but I encourage you to kind of peruse them at your leisure. So as a part of the project, we created kind of a few different series of learning objects. One of them are screencast discussion questions. And this was something that we had been thinking about doing, but then once the COVID-19 pandemic started at the beginning of 2020, it became really kind of important for there to be ways for students to engage with these tools and concepts without necessarily having access to a lab to play around with the tools themselves. So these discussion questions are paired with the BitCurator screencast tutorials that were already kind of available through the BCC. And what they are a series of discussions that are meant to kind of encourage engagement with the BitCurator environment. So there are discussion questions that kind of go through, some of the technical aspects, why was this action performed, kind of getting into some of the nitty-gritty stuff that's shown on the screen. And there's also for each of these kind of an answer key, although many of the questions themselves are subjective and depend on, kind of the scope of the course and, the knowledge of the student. But there's just kind of a wealth of information here. So that is one kind of type of learning object. There are, many of these kind of screencast discussion questions. The other thing that I'll highlight are these hands-on exercises. These were adapted from Cal and Cam's Advanced Digital Forensics class for the SAA. The sample data that is referenced in all of these slide decks is available on GitHub now through the BCC Documentation Training Committee. So you can, if you would like, just kind of see the entire slide deck, see all of the exercises together, but we've also broken them out into the different tools or concepts that they cover. So if you just want to look at exercises on file format characterization, you can look at those exercises and the data that's paired with them. So this was really us trying to address an articulated need of having hands-on exercises that are kind of paired with data that you can use to complete the exercises themselves. The last kind of series of learning objects we created was kind of in an effort to extend the life and the reach of the OSS ArcFlow resources. So we took the guide that was created as a part of that project and also the different kind of example workflows from different institutions and created a series of learning objects for students to engage with the workflows in different ways. So for example, a cross-institutional workflow analysis exercise, which I co-created with Rhiannon from our advisory board. And this really is just, looking at workflows from two different institutions, comparing and contrasting them using the resources created by OSS ArcFlow. So I will also highlight a few other kind of milestone learning objects from the project. The first one is the curating potentially sensitive information in digital collections learning object. This was one of the first learning objects that we created in the project. It actually predates my time on the project, but I think it's a really great kind of robust learning module with a lesson plan and the slide deck, which really goes over both identifying potentially sensitive information within a disk image and then also redacting that information. So that is available on the website. And another one that I want to highlight are the BitCurator guidelines or BitCuratorEdu guidelines for hosting remote internships. It's interesting how much the world has changed over the course of the project, but this was kind of at the beginning of the pandemic when a lot of internships suddenly had to transition to remote online only internships or work studies, whatever kind of student work relationships that were going on. So these were just guidelines that we created in partnership with Sheridan Sales, who I think is on the call, and also Meg Tamala, in basically how to make sure that these, internships are still a kind of rewarding experience for the student and for, the practitioner who's paired with them, and also to, how to kind of best go about these kinds of internships in kind of an ethical manner. So the last one that I will highlight here before talking about the white paper is the BitCurator Talking Points database. This was a really kind of extensive partnership that we had with a number of people from continuing education practitioners. We partnered with some people from the Council of State Archivists to address this need that really is one of the biggest barriers that a lot of practitioners, educators, students encounter when trying to learn the BitCurator environment, which is really just getting the requisite permission to install the software, even as a virtual machine. So this is a database of basically advocacy talking points for a number of different scenarios. And I will briefly just kind of show it. This is available. If, let's see, I can drop the link in the chat to this. Yeah, so this basically goes through, some of the benefits that you can use to advocate for the use of BitCurator at your institution, some of your requirements and needs that you might need to talk to your administrator or your IT manager about, some common barriers and misconceptions, not only about the BitCurator environment, but about open source software in general. And then some of our kind of working group definitions, or some of our working definitions for different stakeholder groups. So hopefully this will be kind of an ongoing resource that can be used and added to by the BitCurator Consortium and the community of practitioners, because this is really something that we heard a lot when we were interviewing and surveying educators and practitioners, that I would really like to learn how to use the tools in the BitCurator environment, but I can't even get permission to install it on my work machine. So hopefully this will be helpful in addressing that. So again, feel free to kind of go through these at your on your own time. The next thing that I will talk about is the BitCurator Guide for Educators. So this is the white paper that we wrote in collaboration with our advisory board and other partners. It provides instructors with advice, ideas, materials to support the inclusion of digital forensics concepts, tools, and methods into LIS courses. So there are three main types. Oops, did I go back? Okay, yeah, there are three main types of lessons that we cover in the guide. The first one is conceptual framing lessons and activities. So this is a type of lesson that is, just kind of more conceptual and theoretical, doesn't necessarily involve hands-on engagement with tools in the BitCurator environment. Self-directed student exploration. So this is where a lesson where you might have students explore a number of different kind of digital preservation tools, including BitCurator, through documentation or videos, or, if they're feeling brave and they have the capacity, try downloading the virtual machine and see how it goes. And then also hands-on exercises and assignments. So really, giving students a chance to engage hands-on with the BitCurator environment, and kind of, just play around with it in a more forgiving environment than, when they may actually be trying to use it at work on, real life materials. So for each lesson type, we kind of have an overview of what this lesson type is and why and when you might want to use it in a course. Prerequisites for student knowledge, instructor knowledge and preparation, and what kind of equipment and technology you might need, which, as you might imagine, kind of progresses from less to more as you get kind of less to more hands-on. And then practices and examples, which are learning objects and other examples created by the project to achieve certain learning objectives and outcomes. So that is available on the website. I will drop that link in the chat as well. Oh, Jess already did that. So yes, and as she notes, there's a download link, which is at the bottom of the page, but that is where the white paper is, which, you know, it's mostly text, so I'm not going to kind of show it all, but that will also be uploaded to Zenodo before the end of the project, so it'll have a nice shiny DOI, but at the moment you can access it through the BitCurator consortium website. So the last, you know, kind of couple things that are in the guide, there's really kind of robust troubleshooting advice in addition to the troubleshooting advice that's already on the BitCurator wiki. We've added more that's specifically, especially from Cal's experience, teaching the BitCurator environment in multiple scenarios and having to troubleshoot through different installation problems. And resources from the BitCuratorEdu project, the BitCurator consortium, and other projects like OSSR Flow are also in a section of that guide. So with that, I will hand it off to Jess to close us out.
Sure, yeah. So we are, sorry, you can go ahead. I'm going to talk about future directions on the next slide. So I'm going to start with talking a little bit about what the BCC Educators Membership Working Group did. I talked about it a little bit before, but they piloted 3 student-focused events in the winter and spring of 2022 as potential benefits for an educators membership. This group is sunsetting in the next 9 days here, and they are making recommendations to the BCC membership committee and the executive council, and really the community at large, about what is useful to continue to build an educators community. If you head over to the next slide, I can share some of those recommendations. They are to keep repeating the Great Question event and target outreach to students and educators. So this event was the most popular and successful event that we tried. The BCC has been putting on this event over the years, but this time we did one specifically for students and educators. There's significant infrastructure already built around this event that makes it pretty easy to redo. And we thought that extra communication support might be needed to help target students and educators, particularly because the instructors represented on the working group expressed that they would need to know when these events would be held so that they could plan their syllabi around the timing. So just know that we're taking all of those things into consideration as we think about repeating Great Question specifically for students and educators. And then explore the viability of a web-based BitCurator sandbox. I promised to tell you more about why that sounds so complicated. So this was like probably our most common request, extremely common. It surfaced multiple times during the 6-month run of the working group. While it might be fairly straightforward to implement a web-based sandbox, and we could think of many partnerships, maybe with the Emulation as a Service Infrastructure project or other partners, doing the technical work would sort of be the easy part, right? What would be more complicated is to pilot and implement a sustainable hosting and maintenance model for such a sandbox. So we could create it, but how do we sustain it, and how do we make sure that it can actually be used long-term? Who would be responsible for hosting? Who would be responsible for maintaining the infrastructure, troubleshooting problems with the sandbox, and administering access? And what would the cost be associated with it? So hopefully the BCC will be looking more into those questions. They're really difficult questions to answer, but we know that this is a big need for the community. It's much different to have like a live hosted version all the time live, you know, on a website than it is to have like the BitCurator software that's in GitHub right now that you download and troubleshoot on your own. And so the next recommendation that the working group has, which you'll see that these recommendations are very similar to what we learned throughout our research in the project. So all of this information really flowed into the BCC through this working group and is flowing to the BCC leadership team based on that connection. But they suggested to distribute a survey exploring the viability of an educators membership tier. So we tried really hard to figure out how to launch an educator's membership by the end of this project, but there were several questions that were still a little bit unclear by the end, which is how such a membership would be structured, if it's going to be an individual membership or an organizational membership, what institutions would be willing to pay, and what kind of member participation in BCC activities could be expected from educators, especially when we know how limited their bandwidth is. And so this working group did recommend that whatever membership tier is explored, these benefits should be open as possible. So for example, faculty should not be the only beneficiaries, but also their students and other staff at their institution. The working group was also fortunate to have a couple of faculty members on our roster. They offered invaluable perspectives on these questions, but also that indicated that participating might be kind of tough. There's just not a lot of incentives in the faculty structure to participate in volunteer working groups outside of their job. It's a little bit different from practitioners' motivations for doing those types of things. So it might be hard for them to really justify and make time for based on that being kind of out of scope of their job. So we're kind of grappling with that, not having the time and capacity to prioritize participating in these activities. But we heard over and over that educators were really interested in memberships that might be able to benefit their students. So we know that continuing to host these student-focused activities and events is the right direction. And then finally, just kind of a meta thing, explore more time-limited working groups. I don't know if any of you are involved in community work, but something that we found that really worked really well in this project was to have a short 6-month period where we were addressing particular questions and had kind of already planned out what our agendas were going to be for that 6 months. And we got so much done in that 6 months. So be kind to your community and try to pull people together for time limited periods. And you'll all probably have a lot more fun and get a lot more done by the end. That was our experience in this project anyway. Next slide, please. And the BCC has always had an educational mission. That wasn't new with the BitCuratorEdu project, and it won't change after the BitCuratorEdu funding ends. Join the BitCurator users Google group to learn about all future BCC events, and I will just drop that into the chat for you real quick. At the BitCuratorEdu Summit, we held a workshop on building an anti-racist digital curation curriculum. This was really well attended. There was high engagement. There was a lot of interest in continuing this conversation. And this conversation had been started before we brought it to this particular space as well. So there were already partners, ready to go on this one. So we have brought a group together. We're actually meeting today for the first time, very exciting, to discuss what a community-focused funded project in this area might look like. Next is, community members really should feel empowered to take up some of the projects that we know need to happen. So, feel free to contact me if you are interested in hosting a project to develop data sets for digital curation education or develop a hosted sandbox version of BitCurator. Even given all the complex questions to answer that we've already identified, we would love for these projects to happen. They can't all happen through Educopia. We just don't have the capacity. So I'm happy to help work with other institutions to make these things happen as well. And then the BCC Membership Committee, in accordance with the BitCurator Consortium strategic plan, will be exploring additional membership models through February 2023 specifically. So that question about what an educator's membership looks like should probably be answered by then. And so just keep an eye out on the BCC website and the BitCurator users Google group for any announcements that, a new membership option might be available. And then on a more near-term and practical note, we will be having a mixer at the Society of American Archivists this year. BitCuratorEdu will still be on our minds during this conference. It's in August, so it's right around the corner. And I'll be planning an in-person social opportunity. So join, again, the Google group to receive the announcement if you're interested in joining that. And in general, you can contact me with ideas, questions, or interest in getting involved in future directions. Like I said, I'm the community facilitator for the BitCurator Consortium, so I can help carry these into the sustaining community. And we hope to see people, develop future learning objects and continue to build upon the structure that the BitCuratorEdu project has already put into place. So I hope that that beautiful webpage that Hannah was sharing with all of those learning objects continues to grow even bigger and bigger into the future. And if you would like to submit anything to the project, or well, the project's over, if you would like to submit anything to the BitCurator Consortium to add to our store of learning objects, please just contact me and I will help make it happen. So I guess maybe I can hand it over to Hannah to close us out. I'm not sure what the next
no. So that's all we have for today. I do want to thank everybody who was involved in this project, not just the project staff that's represented today. Catherine Skinner wasn't able to be here today, and she was just a great co-PI to work with on the project. And then also all of our partners that we work through our advisory board, our professional experts panel, and then all of the practitioners and educators who we actually created relationships with through the project. They responded to the survey, we interviewed them, and then ended up working on learning objects together. It's been a really great experience working with everybody on this project. And yeah, with that, I will just open it up to questions. It looks like there's already some questions in the chat that Cal's answering, but yeah, feel free to raise your hand if you have a question, type it in the chat. Yeah, but thank you all for joining us today.